Well, here it is again. It's Sunday morning. It's kind of a rainy day outside, so I'm just going to do some slow piecing. Use up a bunch of these scraps that I've got on my desk. There's all kinds of colors, different combinations in here. They're odd sizes, but there's enough to make lots and lots of 2-inch strips or 2.5-inch strips, depending on what I decide to do. I also have on my desk some leftover triangles, and they were from previous projects. This one over here is even sewn together, but I can use it in a manner. And also I have lots and lots of squares, cut squares, and today, because of the size of my blocks, I'm going to use 4-inch squares and make half square triangles with light and dark piecing. And I'm going to incorporate those in there. Even though they're bigger, I can trim them down. And then with those pieces over there, I'll find lots and lots of 2 inches wide strips that I can use. So here's what I do. So the first thing I do is I usually work in blocks like this. This is 16, and I lay down on my desktop a number of different 4-inch squares that I consider in my dark category. And then I'll come along and place a light one on top of each of those and draw a diagonal line. So I've marked each of the diagonals using my chalk pencil and a ruler. So the dark is underneath and the light is on top. I mark the line diagonally. I'll sew on either side of the line, then cut on the line and have half square triangles. Now with the ones that were bigger, I just cut some down to the size I need, both of the light and the dark, and I'll just sew them together on a diagonal. And that will give me lots of different squares. And when you're working with scraps, it's a perfect way to use up all of these things. Now I'll just sew them. So I use my regular stitch, and I'm using just a smaller stitch length than maybe normally you would use for sewing. But I like to do that because then it sort of heals itself at the end of the row and I don't have to backstitch. But I'll just do this chain piecing one after the other. I use the side of the presser foot to get a 1/4-inch seam. That's what I want, 1/4-inch seam. Sometimes when these fabrics are in a box, they get bent over, and I should iron them before I try to sew them, but you know, haste. Just make sure the diagonal line is where you want it. And since they're all laid out nicely on top of each other, they just usually, I can pick them up and stitch them. The quarters matching. There we go. So I'll go through the whole lot of those, but I'll just show you what I do. These that are halves already, just make sure that the pieces line up and that I can feed this point underneath the presser foot. and make my 1/4 inch seam. So when I'm making a scrappy quilt, I like to have things that are all different, even though some of these fabrics are the same. When they're placed with the next step, they will look different. So I'll just continue on for a little while. Watching me sew is so exciting. Weather sure has been nice lately. I went out tent camping a couple of times in the last week. Spent a couple of days out at a lovely field listening to some good music. Everybody likes to play their instruments when we go out tent camping. There we go. Then I take these and I cut them apart. I take them then to the iron and press the seam to the dark side. And then I'll take the time to go through and cut them apart. I could use my rotary cutter and my ruler, but sometimes I find this is just as quick. They're small squares. I don't need to have an exactly perfectly rotary cut. I find that even harder to just cut these with my rotary cutter. I'm a scissors person. I grew up with scissors in my hands. I'd have rotary cutters for a long time. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is press these to the dark side, the seam to the dark side, and then I'm going to trim them. So, first step was taking a dark and a light square, putting them together, drawing a diagonal line, and sewing on either side, cutting, and now I've pressed them open. They need to be trimmed. Trimming is probably one of the key features in doing any kind of a quilting project. I cannot piece accurately ever. There, that's good. Ever, so it's important to use your rulers accurately and trim them. So I used a 4-inch block to begin with, and I'm trimming it now to 3 1/2 inches. If you used a 5-inch square to start with, you would trim it down to 4 1/2 inches. Then you could use wider strips to go on the outside of your blocks, probably 2 1/2. That would make a bigger block when you finished. I have a lot of small scraps this time, so I made my blocks. I started with blocks that were 4 inches. So my 4-inch block will be trimmed down to 3 1/2. I put the diagonal row that's on my little 6 1/2 inch ruler on the diagonal, and I make sure that I can get 3 1/2 inches all the way around. There's not much trimming required, but it certainly makes it easier to sew an accurate block when you're done. The other side is fine. So I just go through the whole pile, one after the other, make sure that I trim them all. Make sure that you have a nice sharp ruler so it cuts through. and it just takes a bit of time. I like to just put some music on my devices and sit here and listen to music while I do this. Sometimes I have a book that's on tape and I can listen to it, because this process is just kind of routine and it doesn't really require a lot of concentration, except you just sometimes you have to be careful of your fingers. And I do have a glove that I should wear, you know, but I have enough arthritis in my fingers that I can't hold things very accurately with it. Sometimes you might find that it's a better option, but it takes extra pressure for me to have to hold it down. I guess it would save my fingers, so I should do that. Every once in a while I get it out and I use it. So, trimming just takes a while. In this trimming process, I look at the pieces, and sometimes, you know, I put them together kind of randomly when I pick out the colors to put them together. They're all just squares that have been cut in my square and put in my squares bin. And sometimes I would never think about putting these colors together. But you know, in a scrappy quilt, anything goes. And sometimes I even find combinations that I think are really, really nice and would make a wonderful whole quilt using that color combination. And in that case, I sometimes will take a photograph on my iPad device and keep it in a file folder that I call inspiration. And if I ever go and buy fabric from the store, I might look at that inspiration photo and say, yeah, I remember that square. I'm going to make a quilt using those colors. And I go looking for fabric that has sort of the same colors. Sometimes I do that. Most of the time, though, I just think about all the fabric here that has been partially given to me, partially left over from things that I made. And I remember the blocks that I made and the quilts that I made in the past, and think about all of the things that I've given to other people. It's kind of fun. But I find that a lot of the quilting process is time like this. Not too exciting. One of the things that really helps is to keep my board clean, and I just use the edge of my ruler to scrape those things off. So I'm going to just flip ahead and show you what I do next. On my table, I have all these strips. I showed them at the beginning. I have to make sure that I have 2 inches wide. This one is not quite 2 inches. It's not going to get used. If I don't have 2 inches in this particular project, it's not going to work for me. So I pick out a bunch that are at least 2 inches. They can be wider than 2 inches. I don't care. But here's a piece that's got, I could cut it into squares, but I could also use it in this project. So this is a blue with a sort of greeny brown color. It would look nice with that. So what I'm going to do is take this piece and I'm going to sew one side on the dark side, I'm going to put a strip on the dark side and then put a strip on the dark side. Nothing sewed onto the light side. Just onto the dark side of the dark side. One there and then one here. There's enough here to do that, plus another one. And here's a pile that I've already sewed a strip on 2 sides. Sometimes the strips can be trimmed and I could use the rest of the strip. Sometimes they just kind of meet because that's how long they were. So with this, now I take it and I trim this 5 inches. I started with a 4-inch square, and here's the part of the square that I've already trimmed once, so I'm not trimming that a second time. I'm using it as my guide. 5 inches. The whole thing about sort of using what you've got is that you have to improvise. So, review time. I started with 2 4-inch blocks, cut them in half, made 3.5-inch block. Then I added a 2-inch strip to the side. So my finished block is 5 inches. Now, if you used a different size block to start with, you would use a wider block, and you could determine how big you wanted your block. In my case, I had all these strips that were around 2 inches, or some of them were a bit less, but they'll get used for something else. But 2 inches wide. I had a lot of strips that I had leftovers from all kinds of projects. So if you use a bigger square to start with, you need to use a wider strip to continue with because you want something that's kind of uniform. So what I'm going to do with these is I'm going to take them and sew together 2 blocks. So the light part is at 1/4 and the other light one is at the other quarter. And I'm going to just flip this over and sew down this seam, and that will be my block. Here's a bunch that I've already sewed. Randomly, I put a light to a light diagonally. The darks are still on the outside. And you see they're all kinds of color combinations. Blues, greens, pinks, purples. My lights, I make sure they have white in them. They don't necessarily have to be white, but if you wanted them to be white, make them white. It's all up to what you have in your scrap bin. So all of these, a lot of blue in this bunch. All of these have been sewn together. I sewed that one and it was too small, too short, so I had to add a piece onto it. But they're all one after the other, all different colors. So I made this pile yesterday, and today's pile, as you saw when I was sewing together here earlier, purples, lighter greens, browns, so that what I'm going to do is make that pile up like I made this pile up. And then what I'm going to do is take one from that pile and one from this pile, put them together, sew this seam, sew the dark to the dark, light to the light, and make long strips. And they will be placed up on my wall to create a new quilt. But like I said, use what you've got, try to figure out ways that you can make the pieces that you have work for you, and you can have fun with all of your scraps. I'll just keep working on this until I get it done and making it really big. So here you see on the wall, part of the corner is finished. And I've sewed the rows together on point so that the light part is forming a horizontal row across the quilt. When I get the pieces sewed together, then I just trim the corner blocks so that they're straight and even against the edge of the quilt. I could add other blocks and just add quarter or half size blocks, but this way I could use what I cut off on the left side to fill in on the right side, and what I cut off on the top I can put on the bottom. It'll all work out and it'll form a nice rectangle and make a good quilt. That's it for this quilt. See you next time.